Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're tracing the fascinating, frankly terrifying, falling dominoes of history that transformed the fragile peace of 1918 into the global catastrophe of 1939. The period between the First and Second World Wars really wasn't just some passive pause. We're going to unpack how deep, unresolved grievances, economic houses of cards, and the rise of radical ideologies fundamentally fractured the entire geopolitical landscape. Here is our game plan for today. We'll start by looking at the illusion of peace, then move into the global economic collapse, followed by the terrifying rise of political extremism, and finally, we'll see how the international order completely crumbled. All right, let's jump right into part one, that illusion of peace bubbling just under the surface of the Roaring Twenties. We often picture the 1920s as this non-stop party, but the reality? It was built on some serious rot left over from the First World War. The war left behind a landscape of profound devastation, and the peace treaties, especially the Treaty of Versailles, were highly punitive. The reparations imposed on Germany weren't just a penalty, they were astronomical sums widely considered to be entirely unpayable. This massive roadblock hindered industrial recovery and fueled hyperinflation so severe that German citizens were literally using wheelbarrows full of practically worthless cash just to buy a single loaf of bread. More than anything, it created this deep, festering resentment and a profound thrust for revision among the populace, which laid a highly unstable foundation for this new peace. So that legendary prosperity of the 1920s, that era of cultural dynamism we call the Roaring Twenties, was actually kind of a mirage. It was largely detached from real productive capacity. The massive growth we saw, particularly over in the United States, was heavily driven by unregulated credits, agricultural overproduction, and some glaring wealth inequality. Basically, it was a fragile edifice resting precariously on a foundation of unsustainable debt and speculative fever. Which brings us to a huge turning point. If the 1920s were just a precarious house of cards built on debt and resentment, we have to ask, what exactly happens when that delicate illusion completely shatters? Well, that takes us to our second point, the global economic collapse, or the moment that first giant domino officially fell. There was this highly precarious cycle of dependency at play that is just wild to look back on. Germany's ability to pay reparations to the Allies, that relied entirely on American capital injected through the Dawes and Young plans. Then, the Allies needed those exact reparations to pay off their own massive war debts back to the United States. So the financial health of every single nation relied heavily on the solvency of all the others. They weren't actually solving the debt. They were literally just shuffling it around in a circle. And, as you probably guessed, in October of 1929, that circle broke. The Wall Street crash served as the immediate trigger for an unprecedented global economic cataclysm. Because of that tangled, interconnected web we just talked about, the crash in the U.S. couldn't be contained. It rapidly infected the entire globe. The ripple effect of the Great Depression was just devastating. Investment and consumer spending fell off a cliff, unemployment skyrocketed, and a massive wave of unregulated banks completely collapsed overnight. But what really turned a severe recession into a worldwide depression was the panic. Nations turned inward. The U.S. enacted the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930, severely jacking up import taxes to protect its domestic markets. But of course, other countries immediately retaliated, creating this nasty protectionist spiral that essentially choked off international trade altogether. This level of worldwide suffering really laid bare the inherent flaws of unchecked, laissez-faire capitalism. Millions of people were suddenly plunged into destitution. So when liberal democratic governments looked entirely incapable of managing the shock, populations were left disillusioned, angry, and incredibly desperate for alternatives. And that leads us right into part three, the rise of political extremism and the frantic search for radical solutions. Think about it. When parliamentary debates and compromises seem totally weak and ineffective at solving mass poverty, the appeal of swift, decisive action skyrockets. Totalitarianism didn't just rise in a vacuum. It offered a seductive psychological antidote to the chaos. To a desperate populace, single-party rule and a cult of personality looked like the comforting promise of strict order, national revival, and unquestioned leadership. It eagerly filled the massive political vacuum created by all that economic despair. The source material clearly maps out what these distinct movements fundamentally promised to broken societies. On the right, fascism offered structural cohesion through extreme hypernationalism, the total glorification of the state over the individual, and a corporatist economy. On the left, communism offered structural cohesion through a promised classless society, the complete abolition of private property, and centralized economic planning to end capitalist exploitation. However, impartially speaking, the historical reality for both systems resulted in strict, brutally authoritarian structures. According to the text, fascism utilized racial prejudice, the stripping of individual rights, and the scapegoating of minorities to maintain an iron grip on control. Conversely, communism enforced a rigid single-party hierarchy through violent political purges, forced labor camps like the gulags, and devastating famines caused by forced agricultural collectivization. Ultimately, both systems systematically and ruthlessly suppressed any domestic dissent. So, with these extremist factions firmly in power, crushing their internal opposition and explicitly prioritizing militarism, a glaring question emerges. How in the world did the rest of the international community, the same democratic nations that had literally just fought a world war to ensure lasting peace, respond to this rising threat? Let's look at our final section, the crumbling international order and the absolute failure of diplomacy. The primary guardrail to prevent another global conflict was supposed to be the League of Nations. It was built to enforce collective security. But honestly, its core design practically guaranteed paralysis from day one. It completely lacked its own standing military force, relying instead on member states who, surprise, surprise, usually put their own domestic interests first. Plus, it required unanimous consent for major actions. The U.S. Senate refused to even join, and whenever aggressive nations stepped out of line, the League's sanctions were either inconsistently applied or straight up ignored. Because the League was practically toothless, Western democracies pivoted to a different strategy, one driven deeply by psychology. The fresh, profound trauma of the First World War made these nations desperate to avoid another massive conflict at absolutely any cost. That mindset birthed the policy of appeasement. Leaders continually made concessions, just assuming that aggressive demands were limited and could be satisfied through diplomacy without triggering a full-scale war. But look at how that actually played out in real life. In 1931, Japan invades Manchuria. The League does practically nothing. By 1935, Italy invades sovereign Abyssinia. Crickets. In 1936, Germany completely defies the Versailles Treaty and marches right back into the Rhineland. And then in 1938, the Munich Agreement literally hands over the Sudetenland to Germany in the name of peace. Instead of preventing war, this total lack of unified resistance continually emboldened nationalist powers. It basically proved to them that the democracies ultimately lacked any real resolve. Then, the ultimate game changer hits in August 1939. The balance of power shifted completely with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This non-aggression treaty between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union contained secret protocols to literally carve up Eastern Europe between them, removing the very last diplomatic hurdle. Fast forward to September 1st, 1939. Germany invades Poland, and the Second World War officially begins. Wrapping up this explainer, the source material points us to a really sobering reality. Peace is never guaranteed. It's not some static achievement you unlock and keep forever. It is a fragile, deeply dynamic, ongoing effort. The interwar period is a perfect, terrifying example of exactly what happens when our vigilance fades, when our institutions weaken, and when a collective commitment to peace is totally abandoned in the face of economic hardship and radical nationalism. So, as we look back at all those historical miscalculations, the massive economic vulnerabilities, and the terrifying cost of failed diplomacy, I want to leave you with this final thought. Are our modern international institutions actually robust enough to withstand the dominoes of economic strain and political extremism today? The lessons of the interwar period definitely still echo loudly into our modern world, reminding us of the profound consequences of unchecked ambition. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer.